Welcome back to NASCAR World News. Richard Childress just publicly stood up against the entire NASCAR garage for the way they have been handling Cletus McFarland, and the man who fired the opening shot was Kyle Busch. Here is what Busch said about Cletus ahead of the Rockingham debut. He looked at McFarland's racing background, a handful of ARCA starts, one last-place Truck Series result at Daytona where he only completed 5 laps, and said, and we are absolutely not making this up, that his 10-year-old son has more racing experience than Cletus McFarland. His 10-year-old son. That quote spread everywhere, instantly. It was brutal, it was targeted, and it established the tone for how a large portion of the NASCAR garage was going to approach this entire situation. Busch was far from alone either. Kyle Petty stepped forward and declared that internet personalities like McFarland simply do not belong on a racetrack alongside professional stock car drivers. Bubba Wallace's veteran spotter, Freddie Kraft, took swings on social media, pointing directly back to the Truck Series Daytona debut, where Cletus crashed out within the first 6 laps. Multiple drivers, multiple insiders, multiple voices throughout the garage, all lining up to hammer the same message home. This guy does not belong here, and putting him in a race car is a publicity stunt, not real racing. And then, Rockingham happened, and rather than the criticism fading away, it actually intensified. Cletus McFarland climbed into the number 33 Richard Childress Racing Chevrolet on April 4th for the North Carolina Education Lottery 250. He qualified 35th. He collected a speeding penalty in Stage 3. He lost the rear of the car repeatedly throughout the afternoon. He crossed the line 32nd out of 35 cars, 6 laps down. Kyle Petty cracked on the broadcast that Cletus discovered sections of Rockingham that no other competitor had ever explored before. Bubba Wallace's spotter said he made a poor call on lap 3 going 3 wide. And then NASCAR made everything official. Cletus McFarland is not cleared to race at Talladega Superspeedway. Not yet. Not until they witness more development. So with all of that serving as the backdrop, Richard Childress, one of the most legendary team owners in the entire history of this sport, the man who handed Dale Earnhardt Sr. his championship machinery, sat down and responded directly, and he did not filter a single word. Childress said he believes certain drivers are beating Cletus up, and it is, in his exact words, a little excessive. He said Cletus is a rookie. He reminded the entire garage that Cletus crossed the line 4th in an ARCA race. He pointed out that this man has been racing consistently and putting in genuine effort and does not deserve to be treated as though he simply wandered in off the street with absolutely no foundation whatsoever. And then he dropped something that completely reframes the entire conversation. He said he believes the reason certain drivers are attacking Cletus so aggressively is because Cletus is commanding attention that they themselves are not receiving. Jealousy, pure and straightforward. That is what Richard Childress, 77 years old, one of the most deeply respected figures in NASCAR, is identifying as the engine behind the pylon. And the numbers support him in a manner that is simply impossible to dismiss. The O'Reilly Auto Parts Series race at Rockingham that Cletus McFarland participated in was up 12% in ratings compared to the identical race 1 year prior. Total viewership climbed 11%. 11% in a media landscape where sports ratings are a constant battle, and NASCAR has spent years grinding to expand its audience, particularly among younger demographics. Cletus McFarland showed up for a single race at a track called Rockingham and shifted the needle by double digits. That is not insignificant. That is precisely what Richard Childress said he was anticipating when he originally structured the agreement. Childress discussed how when the concept first reached him through Ty Dillon, he immediately recognized it as something far larger than just a race entry. He viewed it as a pipeline. Cletus McFarland carries close to 5 million subscribers on YouTube, 5 million people who track this man's every automotive adventure, and Childress said if even 10% of those followers begin attending races, begin watching NASCAR, begin purchasing tickets, that represents a massive injection of fresh energy into a sport that desperately requires it. You can debate endlessly about whether Cletus belongs on the racing surface. You simply cannot debate what his presence delivers for the sport's overall reach. And Cletus himself has been one of the most compelling elements of this entire story because he has not retreated for a single moment. Before the Rockingham race, when the criticism from Busch and Petty and others was reaching its absolute peak volume, Cletus went on record with NASCAR journalist Bob Pockrass and said something that genuinely stopped people cold. He said if Richard Childress contacted any of those individuals criticizing him and extended them a ride offer, every single one of them would have accepted immediately. Every single one. And he is completely correct. Nobody declines a Richard Childress racing opportunity. Nobody. The criticism is not genuinely about whether the opportunity itself carries legitimacy. The opportunity is with one of NASCAR's most celebrated and decorated organizations. The criticism is entirely about who received it. He also acknowledged that he monitors the social media conversation closely, given his background, and remains fully aware of everything being said. He was not defensive about any of it. He was not rattled by a single word. He said they can voice their complaints as loudly and as long as they desire. It is happening regardless, and they had better prepare themselves. Now, here is where everything becomes even more fascinating, because the voices standing behind Cletus extend well beyond Richard Childress. Dale Earnhardt Jr., who did publicly state he would not approve Cletus for Talladega or Daytona based on what he witnessed, also described Cletus's Rockingham performance as phenomenal in the very same conversation. He said, and these are his actual words, "I know he busted his rear a couple times, but to do what he did was really, really phenomenal." Dale Jr. praised the effort completely. He praised the attitude thoroughly. He walked Cletus through the specific challenges of that particular Rockingham surface and tire combination and explained precisely why it represents one of the most demanding setups on the entire schedule. He was not piling on, he was mentoring. That is an entirely different thing from what Kyle Busch was doing. And then sits that ratings figure right in the center of everything that nobody on the criticism side wants to acknowledge. 12% rating increase, 11% viewership gain at Rockingham, a venue that does not carry the brand recognition of Daytona or Talladega, a Saturday afternoon race in April, and it moved those numbers because one YouTuber with 5 million subscribers was entered in the field. What happens when Cletus eventually reaches Talladega? What unfolds when he gets to Daytona? If Rockingham shifted the needle 11%, what does a superspeedway appearance produce? That is the business calculation Richard Childress is running through his mind. That is the business calculation NASCAR leadership is running through their minds. Because when everything is stripped away, this is a sport that needs fans urgently. It needs younger fans specifically. It needs people who would never normally tune into a Saturday night race to suddenly feel genuinely invested in what is unfolding on that track. And Cletus McFarland, for all the commentary about his lap times and his speeding penalties and his 32nd place result, accomplished something that very few developments in recent NASCAR history have managed to pull off. He convinced people who had never watched an ARCA race at Rockingham to sit down and tune in. The drivers criticizing Cletus are not entirely mistaken that experience carries weight. It absolutely does. Rockingham demonstrated that clearly. He requires more racing before approaching a superspeedway, and NASCAR was correct to slow things down regarding Talladega. But the framing of the criticism, the suggestion that Cletus McFarland competing in a NASCAR race represents some kind of disrespect toward the sport, is precisely where Richard Childress draws his firm line. And honestly, it is genuinely difficult to argue against the man who has been constructing and operating champion NASCAR programs before most of Cletus's YouTube subscribers were even born. Kyle Busch's 10-year-old son comment landed perfectly. It generated clicks, it circulated everywhere, but it also exposed something revealing about how threatened certain corners of the NASCAR garage feel when someone arrives from completely outside the traditional pipeline and immediately generates more conversation and attention than most full-time drivers accumulate across an entire season. That is not Cletus's burden to carry. That is the garage's own issue to work through. Childress made it unmistakably clear that the Cletus McFarland chapter is nowhere near finished. Additional races are coming, additional learning, additional laps, and if the ratings continue moving in the direction they traveled at Rockingham every single time Cletus suits up, the voices doing all the complaining are going to find themselves in the deeply uncomfortable position of being proven loudly and publicly wrong for a very considerable stretch of time. Cletus McFarland is not disappearing. Childress guaranteed that personally, and the NASCAR garage is simply going to have to accept it.